Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really fascinating analysis of Venezuela's huge decision to slash oil exports to the United States. Now, the big question is, was this a move of desperation, or was it actually a calculated strategic strike in a long-running economic war? Let's get into it. Yeah, so the core argument of the analysis we're covering is that this wasn't some last-ditch effort by a struggling nation. No, not at all. It's presented as a complete inversion of the power dynamics, something that's actually been years in the making. Okay, so let's dive into how this all went down. We're going to start with the event itself, the sudden shock. Then we'll rewind a bit to get the historical context. After that, we'll really unpack the alleged strategy behind it all, look at the global implications, and finally explore the ripple effects. It's quite a story. All right, first up, what actually happened? Well, in late 2024, Venezuela just suddenly announced this major shift in its oil export policy. And, it sent some serious shockwaves through the U.S. energy sector. So get this. The Venezuelan government announced it was going to reduce oil shipments to the United States by over 60%. Officially, they framed it not as retaliation, but as simple economic pragmatism. But you have to wonder, right? Was that the full picture? And I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this drop. We're talking about shipments to those crucial Gulf Coast refineries plummeting from a daily average of around 400,000 barrels all the way down to under 150,000. And this happened almost overnight. That's a huge change. And this is where things get really interesting because it created two very different narratives. On one hand, you had Washington projecting confidence, saying, hey, we're resilient, we can adapt. But the source we're looking at highlights that industry insiders were, well, they were alarmed. And why? Because a lot of these refineries were specifically built decades ago to process Venezuelan heavy crude. It's not like you can just swap in a different type of oil. It's a bit more complicated than that. Okay, so to really understand why this happened, the analysis argues we've got to look back. This wasn't something that happened in a vacuum. It was a result of decades of escalating conflict. You can see the relationship really started to sour back in the late 90s after Hugo Chavez took power and nationalized the oil industry. Things got even worse with the 2002 coup attempt that the source we're looking at says was supported by the U.S. All of this really culminated in the start of heavy sanctions back in 2017. And the stated goal of this sanctions policy was crystal clear: cripple the economy and force a change in government. I mean, the economic impact was devastating. Billions in assets frozen, oil production devastated, hyperinflation. But here's the thing. The government in Caracas did not collapse. It bent, for sure, but then it adapted. Which brings us to the central argument of the source material. How did Venezuela survive all that pressure? Well, the claim is that its survival was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate strategic pivot away from the United States. Now, the analysis points to 5 key factors that it claims are being missed by a lot of the media. First, this was a long-term strategy. They'd been diversifying their markets for over 3 years. Second, it was a coordinated action with advice from Russia and Iran and financing from China. Third, the timing was deliberate, exploiting tight global oil markets and low U.S. reserves. Fourth, it's part of a bigger regional trend in Latin America of shifting away from U.S. influence. And finally, and this is absolutely critical, it involved financial decoupling, using currencies like the yuan and rupees to bypass the U.S. dollar. And this quote from Venezuela's oil minister really illustrates the official justification perfectly. He said, "The country would no longer accept being treated as a subordinate supplier while facing continuous economic warfare." In other words, they were seeking new partnerships that offered respect and long-term stability. The decision was presented as a final, non-negotiable deal. And according to the source, this isn't just a story about Venezuela. No, it's a story about a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. A new world order, perhaps? This shift is towards something called multipolarity. So what does that mean? Basically, it's an international system where power is spread out among multiple major countries, moving away from a world where there's just one dominant power. The analysis argues that the rise of powers like China has created a world where smaller nations suddenly have alternatives to just accepting U.S. demands, and that, of course, really reduces the cost of defiance. And you can see this happening all across Latin America, which for over a century was often considered America's so-called backyard. The analysis points to a whole wave of economic and political decisions, from Brazil to Mexico to Argentina, that really suggests the era of automatic alignment with Washington is coming to an end. So the crucial point here, really, is the financial one. Every single oil deal done in a currency other than the US dollar, like what we're seeing here, it chips away at the primary tool of American economic power. It's a big deal. So what does this all mean in practical terms? Let's talk about the ripple effect. The source outlines several direct consequences. Okay, so the most immediate impacts are on energy markets. You could see upward pressure on fuel prices, which for U.S. consumers could mean higher prices for gasoline and diesel, especially in the southern U.S. For the industry, we're talking costly adjustments for those Gulf Coast refineries. But the long-term geopolitical impact, the source argues, is actually a loss of American strategic competence and credibility on the world stage. And this leads to the source's really realist conclusion. The U.S. assumption that just inflicting enough economic pain would force a political surrender, well, it was wrong. Instead, what the sanctions actually did was create the incentive for Venezuela to build the very systems that now allow it to operate without American approval. So in a way, the policy kind of backfired and accelerated its own irrelevance. So what we are witnessing, according to this analysis, is not some temporary disruption. It's not a glitch. It's a symptom, a sign of a new geopolitical reality taking shape. It's a fundamental recalibration of global power. And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought. Venezuela has basically demonstrated a path, a playbook for how to resist a superpower. So the question now is not if other countries will follow, but how many and just how quickly.